planner with the city of Raleigh. We have some other city staff, some consultants, and then our guests. Thank you for joining us. So this project is part of our New Bern station area planning process, where we're thinking about bus rapid transit stations that are going to start construction next year along New Bern. And obviously, every transit rider at some point in their trip is a pedestrian, and it's critical that we address these safety issues and first mile, last mile.
A participant has left the meeting.
If we're doing some work on New Bern that translates to the other BRT corridors, or for that matter, the city as a whole, then there's no reason not to, if we have something that works, use it everywhere. So this also is going to have potentially a citywide focus to it. And let's just start from this premise right here. I think we're going to have some lively speakers, but there's going to be some seriousness to this because we have a problem. We have a problem in the city of Raleigh. We have a problem in this country with pedestrian safety. It is not getting better. It is getting worse. It is about speed and space. And we have devoted in this country space to people driving and to be able to drive essentially as fast as they want. And it's taking a toll. But even worse than that, the equation, and we have a speaker who has really elevated this issue. The equation is changing. When we set speed limits, we were thinking about vehicles that were 2,500 pounds, 3,000 pounds. That is not the typical vehicle on our streets today. It is much larger, much taller, much more massive than that. And what I just learned from helping my son in his science class is that force equals not just speed, right? Speed times mass. That is force. So the force on our streets is increasing. It is not what it was. And we also have an enforcement issue. The toll, we'll see some slides that talk about the statistics. And those numbers are horrible. They're personal. And there's far too many. And they're also, frankly, the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the toll that this issue is taking on our society. Because what isn't seen, what is hidden, is the trips that are not taken. Because there are not safe places to walk and to bike. And the effects that that has on community health, on climate change. In fact,
participant has
there is
joined
no
the
way
meeting.
to solve those issues without solving this issue at the same time. We can't solve climate change unless we get this right. We can't improve community health. All the federal healthcare legislation in the world won't fix it unless we allow people to live more healthy lifestyles. So with all that said, it does come down to the individuals who are touched by this. My wife works at Wake Med, and she often decompresses at the end of her day by telling me the patients she's seen, and far too often, I would say weekly, he is treating someone who has been involved in some kind of auto violence. And it's hard for her. It's obviously worst on the person themselves and the people that they love. It is a weekly, daily bloody toll on our streets that we have to address. So when we think about what is on the table, so to speak, for this summit, for really more broadly the city of Raleigh and even the state of North Carolina, what are our limits here? What are our constraints? I say there are no constraints, no limits to what we need to do and think about to address this issue. The state does not allow cities to set citywide speed limits. We have to do it piecemeal. And the city of Raleigh is doing a great job in starting to address this, but there are big barriers that the state sets for us. Camera enforcement, that's proven to work. Can't do it. Anti-jaywalking laws, insufficient penalties for reckless driving. There's a whole suite of things that we can't just solve at the municipal level. So, are these important enough to go to the General Assembly? And if we don't, who will? That's the purpose of the summit, is to take on these big ideas. You know, if we do it successfully, we might just save a life. Working together, cities across the country, we might just save the planet. So the stakes are high. The passion is here. I know you're all committed. I can't wait to hear what comes out of the summit. Let's get started. We have a couple of fantastic speakers. Locally, Raleigh's own Neptune is here to talk about this issue and what he sees on our streets. And then remotely, we have Angie Schmidt, who has really shaped my thinking and really elevated this issue, I think, in a way few other people have nationally. I'm super excited to hear what they have to say. I'm going to first turn it over to Paul Wack, our bike ped coordinator, and he's going to speak about some of the work that the city's doing. And then we'll hear some statistics about where we're at right now, a snapshot of the state of this issue, and then we'll get to our speakers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
All right. So we were tasked by council with looking at different safety programs around the country so that we could find sort of the best matches for Raleigh based on some proven techniques. We were asked to look at proven countermeasures that we can do with infrastructure. As Jason pointed out, there's only so much we can do. There are things that are out of our control. So what are the things that we have control over where we can make a dent in some of the traffic violence that's happening? We also want to think about equity. A lot of the initial safety programs in the US were really centered around enforcement. It turns out that ended up being problematic, particularly in communities where there are a lot of people of color. And we don't want to replicate those mistakes. So we want to do better. We want to make sure that we serve those underserved communities and go out and listen. If we want to put in a bike lane, they might say, that's great, but really what we want are the potholes filled and the streetlights fixed first. We need to go out there and make sure that we're hearing those concerns. And then looking at the staff level. Council did authorize in the most recent budget a full-time safety staff position devoted to this effort. Again, we are trying to deprogram nearly a century of development based around the automobile. This is not going to be overnight. It's going to be first lots of smaller tweaks and building up that critical mass that's needed to sort of get people to stop thinking about cars first in our public streets. It's not going to happen quickly. So I just ask everybody to be patient. As much as I love the big picture side, working with the folks who are implementing, they have a very different view of how this is going to work. And it will probably take a generation or so to really make a big dent, but we got to start because there are people getting injured every day. And that's it for me. I'm short and sweet to the point. I'm a bullet point kind of person.
Thanks, Paul. So we are now going to hear from Alta, and they have been helping us out with this New Bern planning project and also collecting some statistics nationally. So they're going to talk about what they've learned specifically on New Bern, but also provide us with some Raleigh perspective as well.
Can you all hear me now?
Yep.
Awesome. I'm used to the WebEx. The mute was eluding me there for a minute, but well, Jason and Paul, thank you all so much for that that opening, and appreciate y'all's leadership around this topic. And thank everybody that's here today. It's really neat to see the people in the room who I know and have worked with over all these years, and the folks that are online who I've known and worked with all of these years. So this is a really good opportunity for us to put our heads together. So really appreciate this opportunity. So we'll keep doing the hybrid thing. And wanted to, this is the agenda in 2021 style graphic. So we're gonna do some polling here just in a second, just to get folks warmed up to some topics. I'm gonna spend a little bit of time talking about Raleigh today with some of the focus that we've been doing along the New Bern corridor. Then we'll have our guest speakers, Nick and Angie, talk. That'll take us through about the first hour. We're going to spend the majority of our time there on items 6 and 7, where we break out into groups. I think we're probably at a size where we might do 1 or 2 groups there on site. We'll probably just do 1 virtual group, and then we'll come back together and share some of the ideas that we've been having. So we want to spend the most of the time hearing from you all. So stick with us and enjoy this first bit of presentation. So just one polling question that we'd like to try with you all. If you can open your smartphone or your browser, another browser if you're on a computer, and go to menti.com and type in that code there, 1322-9357. We're just going to do kind of an intro warm-up question here, and just want to get some feedback and thoughts around this first question, just to get the conversation going. So the question is, how do you feel walking and bicycling in Raleigh today? This is we're doing this as an open-ended question, just to get a start and a warm up. So as people provide their comments. They'll get added here so everyone can see. Yeah, how does it feel walking and bicycling today? And I guess, put yourself in your own shoes, but think about other people's shoes too, and how it might feel walking and bicycling on Raleigh roads. And we'll just get this as a starting point. And what we're going to do is take some of this information and pull it forward into some of our group discussions. And so thanks for participating. So, good stuff coming in already. Stretches of comfort interrupted by moments of terror and anger. Sounds about right. That would sum up mine and Jason and Timothy's and Paul's and everyone in the room. Like, our entire career is trying to fix those moments of terror and anger. And like Paul mentioned before, it's a challenge and an uphill battle to go back and retrofit what we've built out of all these years. But that's a good summation. Some people feeling fairly comfortable, generally safe. Some feeling about depends where I am. Better than it was. So we're seeing maybe there's some improvement happening. We'll talk a little bit about that with some of the City of Raleigh programs.
A participant has left the meeting.
Sometimes great, sometimes very frustrating. Looks like speeding traffic is a concern for some folks. Could be worse. So that's an interesting point. So I'm kind of hearing a mixed bag. And I think for some of us, we're all bicyclists and pedestrians in many cases. I think if we were hearing from the general public that isn't as comfortable, hasn't been doing this their whole life, they might be even more concerned. Some concerns about connectivity, not feeling safe unless you're protected bicycle lane. Hearing a lot of this really depends on geography. And I think that's one of the things that we're finding, that some parts of Raleigh are pretty good, other parts are not. Is that right? Is that good for all of our communities? As long as I have a sidewalk or path to be on, I'll walk. And so I think that's a pretty common viewpoint for most people that live in Raleigh. And so again, it kind of depends on where you are. So, in many ways, I think that the city has made a lot of strides to connect bicycle and pedestrian facilities. So in many ways, this is kind of like, it feels like we have started and begun, but we have a good ways to go. So we're going to keep, for the sake of time, we're going to keep on rolling here. Back into the presentation. Thank you all for your participation. I'm going to talk a little bit about just some background information, and it may not be as shocking to this group, but I think it should be shocking to everybody in the United States and the city of Raleigh to see what's happening in our country, to Jason's point. A recent report, Dangerous by Design by Smart Growth America, was released, and pedestrian fatalities are on the increase in a very consistent and unfortunate and steady way. The last 4 years, the most deadly in 3 decades. We actually had a decline in pedestrian crashes happening for a while, but we are back on the increase right now, and it's something that's a really big problem in our communities, and something that is impacting us here in Raleigh as well. And I think that, out of this report as well, it's real important to know that the burden is not shared equally. So when you look at relative pedestrian danger, when we're really looking at that point as, how many people are killed while walking, controlling for the number of people that live in that area and the people that walk to work, this is what relative pedestrian danger is. And you can see that people of color are very disproportionately impacted and affected. And again, this is, points to the fact that we've got some work to do. Is the infrastructure not there? What different communities are dependent on walking and biking? But this is a serious problem, and seeing this information is really powerful and important for us to know as a group as we try to tackle the problem that's out there. And many of you have probably seen this before too, but speed and space, I think, is what I heard Jason say earlier. So here's the speed side of things. Big deal when you're talking about speed of traffic. And we know that traditional transportation engineers are trying to get cars through as fast as they can to where they're going. And that's not a good recipe for safety for people walking and biking. It makes a very, very big difference if you're hit at higher speeds than lower speeds. And you can see that impact there. So how can we make a difference in that regard? And sadly, we're still at a point, talk about a generation of improvement ahead of us, Paul, that you mentioned. About 2.5% of federal transportation funds go toward bicycle and pedestrian projects. It's a pretty low amount when you think about the fact that 16% of roadway fatalities in the country are bicycle and pedestrian. And that's been going up. I've been practicing active transportation planning for about 2 decades now. And that number was, I remember around 11%. I remember it was 12. I remember it was maybe 13 or 14. Well, here we are at 16% now. And we're seeing that increase continuing to happen. And so, it's one of those things where, again, it's priorities, and where you put your funding really represents your values. And so as a nation and as a state and as a city, we have some work to do. So getting into Raleigh a little more specifically, 35th most dangerous metro area in the U.S., according to that report, which that's not good. It's not a good place to be. Could be worse, maybe like one of the comments we saw earlier, but it's a problem. There you can see where all the bicycle and pedestrian crashes have been occurring over the last decade or so. For Raleigh, the danger index is on the rise, meaning that we are having increased amount of crashes and fatalities. We'll talk about that here in a minute. About 230 pedestrian crashes per year, 85 bicycle crashes per year. We all know that is actually way lower than what's actual. A lot of these crashes are not reported. A lot of these are near misses that are out there. And so that's all that we know of and are recorded. One of the weird themes that we're seeing more of too are hit and runs. And that's becoming more and more common in our metro areas with pedestrian crashes. And that's something else that we need to talk about and keep an eye on. This is actually Raleigh data. So Paul, I'll send this to you afterwards, in case you haven't done this yet, but pulling the Raleigh pedestrian and bicycle crashes over the last decade or so, that trend line is pretty much matching what we're seeing across the country. So we're seeing an increase in pedestrian crashes on average on an annual basis, slight decrease in bicycle crashes. And this is actually matching what we're seeing nationally as well. Lots of different theories about why that might be. We're certainly seeing a lot more greenways, a lot more separated bicycle infrastructure. But then we're also seeing, move to more urban areas. So that may be part of the reason why pedestrian crashes continue to increase, is the desire to be in a more urban environment. And there are some other potential reasons why this is happening. But safe to say that Raleigh is also in a bad position, and seeing that these pedestrian crashes are heading in the wrong direction. To the point of some of you saying, hey, it's not so bad in some places and some things are improving. Well, there's a reason for that. And so we got to give Paul and the city some credit. I know a lot of city staff here on the call and there in the room. A lot of active programs. I know everyone wishes they were all funded even more than they are, but a traffic management, traffic calming program that has really been getting after reducing speed in some roadways, an active sidewalk program. Some of these are projects that are actively happening right there on your screen. Paul's been doing everything he can to chase the resurfacing vehicles on the road to get bikeways striped whenever possible. Complete Streets program and Safe Routes to School program. So a lot of things that are happening that are positive. And I think that to Jason's point earlier, this is one tool. Do we need more funding? Do we need to commit more to this? But it's also the policy side. That will make a big difference if we continue to move in a better direction. And so I'm almost done here. We'll turn it over to our guest speakers who are going to talk to us today, Nick and Angie. But, part of the reason we're here today is because of our New Bern Avenue transit-oriented community project. And as you all know, the BRT project through this area, and our focus has been really looking at everything that connects into New Bern. And we've been hearing from the public and seeing out there in the field that this is just actually a really classic transect of Raleigh. It's actually been a nice little test for us when we think about it. Starts in the downtown, moves out into more of a suburban landscape, gets across a belt line, and then you're out to some commercial corridors. And the challenges out there for walking and biking are immense. And so through that lens, you can see in this map a number of the different crashes that are happening, crash density around some of these intersections in particular. And we know getting out to the belt line and these commercial corridors where a lot of service workers are trying to get to work, maybe getting to work at Walmart, it is particularly scary and dangerous. Multiple lanes, lots of cars and lots of challenges. So this transect of the city is a good example. Some of you said earlier that bicycling and walking is not so bad in some places. And, there are some parts in downtown, for example, that are not so bad. You've got small, short blocks. You've got a lot of bicycle pedestrian facilities, but you do have a lot of activity, so you do have a density of crashes. But when you get out here, it gets really, really even more difficult. So each part of Raleigh has its own unique challenges. And pictures say 1,000 words. So these are some examples of what you see out on the New Bern corridor today. You see worn footpaths, you see pedestrians that don't have a choice but to walk out in the roadway, even bicyclists that are using some of those worn footpaths and some disconnected infrastructure. So, these are the things that are out there in the environment today that are making it unsafe from an infrastructure standpoint. But it's also just that transition from maybe slower speeds in a downtown out here to where traffic's moving at 45, 55 miles an hour. And it's just incredibly challenging and dangerous to be out there walking and biking. So some of the things that we want to talk about in our group breakouts are going to be some specific things we can do to address these problems. We're going to identify the problems as a group here in a little while, and then come up with some solutions. But before we get to that, I guess I'm going to hand it over to Nick, who I think is there in the room, to kind of give us some of his thoughts and ideas around this topic, and then we'll get to Angie, who is participating virtually. So I'll turn it over to you guys in the room there.
Good afternoon, and thank you for handing it off virtually to me. My name is Nick Neptune, longtime resident of the city of Raleigh. I happen to have the pleasure and the privilege of serving as a commissioner with the City of Raleigh's Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Commission. And I also have the privilege of serving as a board member with Raleigh's longtime cycling advocacy organization, Oaks and Spokes. I'd like to thank my colleagues and friends who have presented on all this data, this information, sort of, I think, setting the table, if you will, with a solid foundation and a sort of a shared sense of kind of where we are present day. I think the hope on my end is to, give that some context as it relates to people, right? And the actual impact on human beings who are living, breathing, right? Walking and biking the experience. I'd like to do that through 3 quick 1-minute stories. 3 stories over 3 minutes. First up, it's a true story. So I was invited over to Y Hill, fantastic restaurant over in Boylan Heights. This is just a few weeks ago. Invited to an event at Y Hill. I'm walking around. I find a place to sit down. And a couple active adults, and if I understand that correctly, active adults means 55 and older, right? Active adults, a couple active adults asked if they could sit with me. They said I looked like a nice guy. They wanted to sit down with me at the event. I said, that's certainly fine by me. They sit down, a lovely couple of active adults, and guess what they tell me? Number one, some years ago, they moved to Glenwood Avenue, right off of Glenwood, near Fred Fletcher Park, because of its walkability, because of it being a walkable neighborhood. They literally were looking up neighborhoods, looking up walking schools. And when they found this walkable neighborhood and its proximity to all the new restaurants, all the new bars, all the new museums, all the new clubs, all the new places to go hear some good music and meet good people, they immediately moved in, and they've been having a great time ever since. And they walked from Glenwood Avenue all the way down to Boylan Heights to Y Hill and sat down with me, a rando stranger, but now a brand new friend. True story. 1 minute. Next up, I find myself walking through the Village District, okay, formerly known as Cameron Village. I'm walking through. I happen to cross by a young man talking to his mother. This young man says to his mom, you know what? I don't think I need a car. I think I'm good without a car. I can walk and I can bike anywhere I need to go. Again, this happened literally weeks ago. I think my heart skipped a beat. This is the future talking. I do not need a car. I can walk and bike everywhere I need to go. 1 minute story. Next up, last one. Little black boy in North Carolina. Some years ago, a little black boy is born in North Carolina. He learns how to ride a bike via some firemen and a traffic garden set up in a parking lot. This little black boy loves to ride his bike everywhere he wants to go, everywhere he needs to catch up with friends, have freedom from the parents. He's having a good time. Fast forward many years later, this little black boy turns into a little black man, moves off to Raleigh, North Carolina. Brand new city for him. He finds himself introduced to his brand new city via new friends and a brand new organization called Oaks and Spokes. Oaks and Spokes literally hosting, organizing events so that this young man can meet new people and get a feel for his new city on bike, through its parks, through its streets, through this burgeoning downtown. Fast forward some years later, about 10 to be exact, that young man finds himself serving as a commissioner with the City of Raleigh Bicycle and Pedestrian Commission, finds himself serving as a board member with Oaks and Spokes, and finds himself serving great privilege and great joy as an advocate for improvements and investments that we so desperately need in our pedestrian and cycling infrastructure. Because when we have those conversations and when we follow through with actions, those are investments in people, human beings who are simply trying to live fully, who are simply trying to participate fully in their backyards, in their communities, in their cities. I'm deeply grateful for my colleagues today who have acknowledged our shared history with growth and development, and the truth in that it's not always been pretty, it's not always been equitable. There is a real shared history of cities, of private development, breaking up, destroying whole neighborhoods in the name of progress. And I think that we have folks who are living with very real memories of all of that right now, today. Folks who look a lot like me, to be quite honest with you. Folks who look like my parents and my grandparents. And those memories are very sharp. I have conversations with folks who look a lot like me, and they tell me stories of being chased off public property, chased away by the police, told, you got to get home, little boy. It's not a good time for you to be out. Chased away by residents. This is not a neighborhood for you. You got to get out of here. But you best get away. My point being, my friends, as we continue to grow and develop and seek to make these investments, I think we also would do ourselves a service in recognizing that it's all in a balance. It's a balanced conversation. We need not grow and develop at the expense of each other. We can grow and we can develop and we can make these investments while we also seek to preserve and protect, to uplift and celebrate cultures and communities that historically have been underserved, right? And as we conduct ourselves in conversation with those communities, it would behoove us to listen first to the real pain and the real suffering that was inflicted. But then let us also follow through and acknowledge the progress that we have made. You see, I am at the table today, and in fact, many more Black and brown, young and old people are participating in the building and shaping of our communities. So as I say to my parents, and as I say to my grandparents, believe me, I understand the pain. I understand the suffering. But today is a new day. Much like y'all chose not to give up and lose faith in each other, let us not give up or lose faith in each other today. As we seek to build, as we seek to invest, as we seek to uplift and celebrate, as we seek to expand access to opportunity, to participate as full human beings, right here in our backyards, in our cities and our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was amazing. And I love the theme of community and the fact that community does depend on our being able to connect and gather in places. And there is nothing that our transportation system right now currently does as well as sever and separate and divide and create these moats of division. And I think that is something that we see in our politics, even in a way that transcends this particular issue. And there's so much, again, going back to the iceberg analogy, so much that's below the surface that relates to solving this issue, whether it's climate change, community health, or just a simple sense of community that's dependent on this. So I would frankly fear for the person who has to follow Nick, except that I know that Angie Schmidt is going to bring a really hard-hitting perspective on this issue too. And I'm really looking forward to this 1-2 punch that we're about to get. So Angie Schmidt.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I have a little presentation prepared I was going to pull up, so I'm just going to share. And I want to say that I really appreciate this discussion and the work that you're doing. I agree with a lot of what's been said already. So I think you guys are on the right page, and some of what I want to discuss may even be a little bit of review from some of it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what I call the pedestrian safety crisis in the United States. So again, that's something that's come up a little bit already. Can you guys see this okay? It's coming up. Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm gonna, in this presentation, I'm gonna explain what I mean by that, who's being affected, where, because it has a strong geographic component. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about cars. It's one of my big interests because that plays a role, what's happening in the auto industry, and then real briefly on solutions. So I'm going to try to breeze through this. We've already touched on this. We've seen about a 50% increase in pedestrian deaths over the last 10 years. And it got worse last year. So my book was completed before the pandemic, and I sort of didn't know what would happen in the next year. It seemed like maybe things would get better because traffic declined so much, but we saw the opposite. We had a huge increase in pedestrian deaths over the last year, especially compared to reduced driving miles. So another thing I just wanted to say real briefly is this is actually really unusual in traffic safety. Since about the 1970s, the pattern has been gradual improvement. We started requiring things like seat belts and airbags. We made some progress, and that has really been reversed, a whole generation of progress on this issue. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why. So first off, I want to talk a little bit about who, and I think when we talk about this issue, I think this is a pretty sophisticated audience, but in the media and everything, there's sort of a stereotype that the kind of person getting killed is like this guy here on the left, and he's a very wired millennial, and he's sort of maybe crossing into a major city, and maybe he's distracted by his phone. And I think that goes back to sort of the privilege of a lot of people who are in the media or in decision-making roles. That might be what they see anecdotally on their drive to work. But really, the kind of person who's getting killed is much more like this guy here on the right, who's just kind of, maybe he's a lower income guy, and he's just kind of sprinting across a pretty wide suburban arterial that hasn't provided even a crosswalk. So I think it's been a little bit difficult for a lot of people to empathize because, again, maybe they have never been put in that position themselves. And our sort of knee-jerk reaction has been to resort to victim blaming a lot. I think that's prevented us from really resolving the issue and making progress. So this has been touched on a little bit, but just to reiterate, this is not a problem that affects different demographics equally. Like we see it with a lot of our public health problems, the institutional racism that's part of our culture so much really comes through in some of this data. And Black folks and Native people are at increased risk. Native people about twice as likely to be killed while walking. But other marginalized groups are also at risk. Pretty much everyone from a oppressed or marginalized demographic is going to be at increased risk. And if people have one or more of those identities, their risk may be even higher. So another group I just want to talk about real briefly is older adults. You can see from this graphic, again, it's from Smart Growth America, that people's risk to be killed this way starts rising when they're as young as 50. And by the time they're 75 and above, they're almost, well, their risk is much elevated. I'm sorry, this data has just changed. The point I want to make about this, though, is this is a fast-growing demographic in the United States. The American population is aging. So right now, about 1 in 4 people almost in the United States are over 65, and that's supposed to grow to 1 in 3 over the next few decades. So older folks are a little bit more vulnerable to being hit and killed while walking. So as the American population ages, some groups like the CDC predicted as far back as 10 years ago that we'd have an increase in pedestrian deaths. And this also is not a group we've done a very good job planning for. Okay, I'm just going to touch on this real briefly too, but I think it's really relevant to the discussion today. We know that probably a lot of you are aware that this is a map of the most dangerous metro areas in the United States for walking. And you can see that there's a really clear pattern. The southeast portion of the United States really stands out as being the most dangerous. And that goes back to this sort of legacy. These cities were developing around the height of the auto era in the United States mostly. So there's a legacy of very wide roads, suburban land use, a lot of things that put people at risk, especially compared to older cities like Boston. But another thing I want to talk about is, we have a big demographic trend, and this is a long-standing trend, but it's accelerated in recent years, where these are the parts of the country, almost without exception, that are fastest growing. And Raleigh is one of those cities that's, fits into that pattern in a lot of ways. And there are also cities that, haven't been making as much progress on this issue, just as a rule, compared to places like Portland and Seattle. So that wide demographic change across the United States can help explain why we're seeing rising numbers as well. Okay, I also want to, again, I'm talking a little bit about where this occurs, where we're having problems. So one thing I wanted to just discuss briefly is we're having some demographic changes in our suburban areas across the country, and I'm using Atlanta here as an example, but this is a racial dot map of Atlanta, and it shows green areas show sort of segregated Black areas, neighborhoods, and orange shows white neighborhoods that are pretty homogeneous, pretty segregated, and then the yellow, this is back in 1990, shows areas that are a little more integrated or diverse. So I just want to go forward and show what's happened in the suburban counties north of Atlanta. And this is not even the most recent data. I don't have the latest census data from 2020, but I would imagine this pattern would be more stark if we had that data. So you can see, the point being, the suburbs are becoming much more diverse. North of Atlanta, there's about 1 million people in both of these northern suburbs now, Gwinnett and Cobb County. And when they were first developed, they were, sort of sprawl locations. There was a lot of white flight out to those areas. And then the expectation may have been everyone would have a 2-car garage. There was really no need to plan for pedestrians. Well, now they're much more diverse. They're more diverse racially, and they're more diverse economically as well. We have this pattern that we talk about, the suburbanization of poverty. Long story short, what that means is we have more folks out in our suburban areas that may depend on transit or walking, and are in environments that really weren't designed with people who walk in mind at all. And our infrastructure hasn't kept pace with the demographic change we're seeing in the suburbs. Okay, so something I touched on earlier, and something that's come up a couple times earlier today, we also see these big racial disparities and in the number of pedestrians that are being killed. And that has to do with a number of things, but one of them being inequality in the kind of infrastructure we're providing. So in this example, I'm using Cleveland. Again, the same racial dot map, it illustrates the same things. So I just want to compare that to, so there you can see we're pretty segregated. You can see here, this map shows our most dangerous corridors, and you can see how sort of nicely they overlap. or I shouldn't say nicely, unfortunately, they overlap almost exactly with neighborhoods of color. And that's something we see across the United States in metro area after metro area. Here's another example I like to use, and this is from Portland. And Portland's a place that's invested a lot, but we still see these kind of patterns of inequality. So here on the left is a map that they produced, Portland Department of Transportation, that shows all the traffic deaths over 2 years, and they use the names of the victims to try and humanize the problem, which I think is a nice touch. But you can see that they're not happening in a random pattern. There's this clear concentration over here on the right side of the map. So if you look over to this map here on the right, what's going on here is in Portland, for people who aren't familiar, there's a big demographic dividing line right here, East 82nd Street, it's called. And everything east of 82nd Street is East Portland. So East Portland is, compared to the rest of the city, more diverse and lower income than the rest of the city. That's an important thing to know. So they mapped here the 30 highest crash intersections. Those are shown in those little dots. 28 out of 30 in Portland are in East Portland. So in Portland, only about a quarter of the population lives in East Portland, but they account for about 50% of the traffic deaths. So people living in those neighborhoods are twice as likely to be killed as the rest of the city. Okay, I tried to warn you guys about this. I'm gonna shift gears a little bit. We talked a little bit about who is getting killed and where. And just a couple points I wanted to reiterate. The American population is aging a little bit, so they're a little bit more vulnerable to being hit and killed this way in the first place. There also tend to be living in more dangerous areas to some extent, more people in the Sun Belt, more people out walking potentially in suburban areas. And then finally, we have this big shift in the auto fleet in the United States, the consumer auto fleet. So this begins around 2009. We have this big shift. And if you look back to when we're coming out of the last recession, about 3 in 4 new cars sold were sedans. They were like, you know, your Honda Civic, typical car. But since then, there's been an explosion in growth in SUVs, especially crossover SUVs. And now the situation is totally reversed. In the latest year we have data for, about 3 in 4 new cars sold were pickup trucks or SUVs. Okay, so I think a lot of you are familiar, so I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but there's a lot of data that shows pretty clearly that this is a safety problem for pedestrians. Pedestrians who are hit by SUVs are struck higher on the body and with heavier vehicles. A report that was issued by the Federal Highway Administration in 2015 found that pedestrians who were struck by SUVs were 2.5 to 3 times more likely to be killed. So we also have this trend with pickup trucks. I'm not going to dwell on this too much. I think a lot of you have probably seen this, where they become super annoying, or aggressive and large with high front ends. And that produces a lot of visibility problems, especially for children, wheelchair users, even shorter women could be vulnerable. Okay, so that's sort of my recap, and I'm going to try to wrap this up here. But again, to reiterate, the population is a little more vulnerable because they're aging, they're in a little more dangerous places, and then potentially, and then when they're struck, they're often hit with heavier vehicles higher on the body, so it's more likely to be fatal. So that's my explanation of why we've seen this big increase. And somebody pointed out earlier, I think it was Jason, and he pointed out something, one of the main points I wanted to make in this presentation is, as planners, and it is difficult for cities to take this on by themselves because the federal government and a lot of our states haven't been good enough partners. And even the agencies we have in Washington that are supposed to regulate vehicles have not really done their part here. So it is difficult, but I think cities like Raleigh, the discussions you're having, you can be a leader, and hopefully they're going to come around and be the kind of partners you need. So I want to just talk real briefly. People always want to know solutions. I know that's what you're here to talk about. just real quickly, this is a woman I talk about in my book, named Amy Cohen, whose 14-year-old son was killed in New York City while he was walking in 2014. She formed this group called Families for Safe Streets there, and she's organizing. She's a social worker by trade. She's organizing other families who have lost people this way, and they've had a lot of success. And I think that it's important to elevate those folks and to build more political space for the kind of improvements that we know we need. So that's part of what I'm trying to do with writing the book and then going around talking about it a little bit. There's also a need for institutional reform, and that's something that's already come up. A project that I was working on with some partners earlier this year was trying to overhaul the MUTCD. We have an important engineering document. It's up for revision in front of US DOT right now. And here's an example of some of the double standards that sort of go back to the thinking of the auto era in the United States. So right now, the MUTCD says a rainbow crosswalk like this is not allowed, but that a brick stamped crosswalk that's a little bit red like this is fine. So there's a lot of double standards that are baked into the way we do business and our institutions that we need to question and we need to change if we're really gonna step up to the need this problem has created. And then I'm just gonna wrap up with this one real quickly, I like to end with this as showing what it's meant to show is this pedestrian refuge island here. And this is a treatment that is really not very new or sexy, I don't think. They are recommended by the Federal Highway Administration. They say they reduce pedestrian crashes about 45%, and they can be installed for just a few $1,000s potentially. But we've lacked the will. And we've lacked, another thing we've lacked is people in positions of authority that are experiencing their cities this way and experiencing how difficult it is. So I think that we need more attention to these sort of smaller details, these sort of missing pieces of our infrastructure that are very apparent when you're on foot that someone who's speeding by in a car might miss. So someone who spoke earlier talked about the need to listen to neighborhoods, and I think that's really true. People always ask, what's the one thing that will solve this? What's the silver bullet? And I think it really depends a lot. It's really a hyper local solutions we need. In some neighborhoods, it really may be street lights or the need for a crosswalk or a new traffic signal. Those folks do sort of know best. And so I think it requires a big shift in planning from doing these big 20-year projects that may be tens, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to doing work that's a little bit closer to the people, that involves a lot more public engagement and sort of going back and doing some smaller scale fixes. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to the group.
Thank you so much, Angie. That was fantastic. One note that I really appreciated and thought about is, in particular, when we think about these, frankly, supersized vehicles that are a major contributor to this, I think we would all acknowledge that it will take some kind of federal action to rein that in. And by the way, it always perplexes me why, when we have the ability with a new car to say it can't go faster than X, or it can't go faster than the speed limit, wherever that speed limit is, it's baffling to me why that's not a requirement. But I would acknowledge that some of that will take some federal legislation. But to say that in the interim, all we can do is sit back and wait and watch and hope, I think is the wrong approach. If you look at an issue like marriage equality, for instance, did that come from Washington, D.C.? No, they were the last in line. That came from, I want to say, a state of Massachusetts first, and Vermont, and cities like San Francisco. They led and they prodded, and that, in fact, changed the reality that enabled more aggressive measures to happen at the federal level as well. So I think when we say, well, we have to wait for the climate to change and then we can act, that ignores the fact that acting changes the climate. And that's what I think we can discuss today. So, before we, get into our breakout groups, I want to see if there are some questions for Nick or Angie or for Matt from Alta, from anyone online or here in person. We have a question?
The statistic about the SUVs and their greater deadliness, has anyone looked at what percentage of the rise in pedestrian fatalities is just due to that? And tried to estimate it?
Yeah, well, there's a study by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. Actually, there's a couple studies. One that just recently came out did attempt to put like actual number figures on how many people were being killed additionally. And it was actually surprisingly small for SUVs. I think it was a few hundred a year, but then for pickup trucks, it assumed that all pickup trucks were sedans, thousands of lives would be saved a year. But in addition, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, they did a study and they found that, I might misstate it a little bit, but there's been like about 30% of the increase is just crashes becoming more deadly than they were. So we're not seeing as proportionally large a number of increased crashes. It's that the crashes that are occurring to some extent are more likely to be fatal. So that's something, either speed may be a factor there as well, but also the larger vehicles seems to be the culprit.
Right, I think, also correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, the federal agencies regulate automotive safety, but my understanding is that they exclusively look at the safety of the occupants of the vehicle and assign zero weight to the safety of people outside of the vehicle and setting safety standards. Is that correct?
Yes, and actually, during late in the Obama administration, they had proposed at least rating cars. So this is not actually regulating them for pedestrian safety, but rating them and warning consumers if they were purchasing a more dangerous vehicle for pedestrians. And the Trump administration actually quashed that. There is some language in the infrastructure bill, though, that would require them to regulate cars and even the front. At last I've seen, unless it's been stripped out, I know that's all sort of in play right now, would require NHTSA to regulate even the front end of vehicles. So we'll see.
The cynic in me wonders whether such a rating system would decrease or increase sales of the vehicles in question. I'll leave it there.
Well, some of the American auto companies actually lobbied against it because they're more heavily invested in the SUVs and pickups, while the Asian companies were more receptive because they have a larger, they're already, they have a bigger market in international spaces that have stricter regulatory requirements.
Thanks.
Do we have any other questions for our speakers? Hearing none online, anymore in person? All right. Well, I want to thank Nick and Angie tremendously for bringing a lot of passion and energy and light to this conversation. Thank you so much. What we're going to do now is transition to the second part of this event. So part one was learn and part two is act. And we're going to take a little break online and in person. We're going to be in, I believe we've settled on 3 discussion groups online. And I think we probably have maybe 2 groups in person. And our facilitators will raise their hands either virtually or in person. We'll kind of split into groups here, and we have some questions or prompts we want to maybe throw out there, although I suspect probably you're going to just come at us with a lot of ideas unprompted, which is fine too. So why don't we take 5 minutes, and either if you're online, take your little break, and please stay if you can for the rest of the afternoon. And in person, we're going to do the same thing, and we'll reconvene in 5 minutes.
Hi, everybody. Um, I'm going to go ahead and do some breakout group assignments.
Has left the meeting.
We've got, should be at least one city staff person ready to facilitate and take notes. I have myself, my name is Ira, and John to my right working for the city. And then one of the speakers earlier, Matt from Alta, will be in a group. And I'm going to let WebEx assign everyone else automatically. And so you can feel free to start if you guys want. Jason said we can take a break, so I think that's, can be up to you and your facilitators, but yes, Bynum.
You need my help with
No, ma'am.
facilitation. I can't tell how many people are actually online.
So there's 15 or so people
Okay.
in the
Great.
WebEx. We're going to split into 3 groups, and we have staff already. So I'm
Okay.
going to do the breakout sessions, and we'll report back, I think, when the schedule says, in 30 minutes or so, 30 or 40 minutes after the discussion.
For folks that are still in the main group here, have you been asked to join a breakout session in your WebEx interface? If you're hoping to join a breakout session, just let us know and we'll help out.
Yeah, Mr. Agnost, I thought I clicked the button, but I'm still here in the waiting room, I guess. I've never done a breakout session before.
Okay, let's give that another try. And then I see Cody. Cody, were you wanting to join a breakout session?
Honestly, I thought Cody and me were in a breakout session together. I was excited.
Well, I mean,
Put me wherever you want me, it don't matter.
we sort of are effectively, since everyone else has gone to a different one. If this space within WebEx could be our breakout session, that's fine.
This is the lack of focus group.
So let's see. I have some questions for us to go through. So the first breakout session is pretty simple. What are the key issues and problems that you see around bicycle and pedestrian safety?
Should I check this breakout session one, join now? Is that going to kick me out of here, or what should I do?
Yeah, I would say join that one.
Okay.
And then you can be part of a larger group. Yep.
All right. Thanks, John.
Yep. And I'm just going to check one more time. Cody, I see you're in the meeting. If you want to join a breakout session, please just let me know and we will get that figured out for you. Here's something a curveball. Hey, Michael, thanks for joining us. We're in our breakout sessions right now. So we've got 2 virtual and 1 in person here at the Design Center. And we should be wrapping those conversations in a couple minutes, and we'll come back to the larger group.
Does you want to join the breakout group?
Michael, did you
No,
want
I'm
to
all
jump in?
good. I'll hang out here for a minute or two.
Okay, all right.
I'm working on a business plan, so
That sounds important.
I'll trade you.
I don't think WebEx has a thumbs down. Hello, sir. Are you here for the safety summit?
Yes.
All right. So we had a couple of presentations as a large group. We have gone into small group discussions.
Ah.
And so we're actually gonna be in those group discussions for probably another 15 minutes or so.
Okay.
So what I can do is I can add you to one of those small group discussions and you can join right in.
Okay.
All right. Let's see.
How will I know the topic of the discussion?
Oh, well, there's facilitators in each group that are from the city. And so they're basically posing questions to the participants. And then you just answer with your personal opinions and preferences.
Okay. Yeah, I talked to Jason about this. He said, okay, let me just do it. I'll just say join now. Okay.
Okay. I somehow. Hi, Jen. How are you? Oh, loser. I mean, my own personal, I could change something.
So I think she joined a meeting.
Okay.
I'm studying tech ed, sorry.
Not on their radar. I think that relationship.
Bike parking is big, one angle, and then council does have a change to the code that would require secure, protected bicycle parking in Newville. With that, let's go ahead and we can just turn back to the alley. We don't necessarily have to relocate over here. But I'd like to hear from our online group and what kinds of issues and strategies you all identified. And then we'll share from our in-person group and see what we all have to do.
Hey, Jason, this is Jason Reyes with Alta. I can share from our group if you like.
Yeah, please do.
So we had Dwight Otwell, Jennifer Delcourt, and Michelle Hood, myself, and Ira in a group. And we, first talked about how awesome the first few presentations were at the opening. We really appreciated that and found those pretty inspiring. And one of the things that jumped out was, seeing Matt and Angie both have that slide of the impact not being shared equally. And so problem identification there that rings true from what we've been seeing in Raleigh and other places is that, that it's not shared equally and that it is something that needs to be addressed when we think about where these solutions are put in place and prioritized. I think the bigger picture, though, of our auto-dependent development that's happening is in the car culture generally in Raleigh, I think is seen as a big root of the problem, and that even when developers are sort of making claims about walkability and bikeability, they're sort of checking those boxes in their plans and proposals, and then the reality on the ground isn't matching that, is what what was communicated. I think an example was I think it was EC Brooks, Magnet Elementary, having sidewalks designed with the carpool lanes, and you have these brand new sidewalks where the teachers are actually assigned to go out, chain them off to make sure nobody's walking on them because of the way the cars are cycled through there. And so that's just an example of a good intention, or at least a good thought going into a new development, and then it's just not working out the way it's supposed to. I think another topic that came up around equity was just, wanting to be sure we're delivering the types of infrastructure that people want. We know in the New Bern example, some people didn't even want new sidewalks there because they saw it as a tool for gentrification and a symbol of it. And then in other places, we've seen people that might not want new bike lanes as a sign of gentrification, but they might really want the sidewalk infrastructure or the bus improvements because that more reflects how their community gets around. And so wanting to not think monolithically about our communities in Raleigh and being sure that we're adapting the recommendations accordingly. A couple more things. We talked about city council support. We felt like it's there, that the city of Raleigh does have some champions for it. But that some of the issues come around staffing levels and not having the staffing level supported high enough to avoid bottlenecks in project development and project delivery. So that the political will is there. It's just this this other aspect of putting that into implementation, even in terms of the staffing levels. Finally, just a couple more things. We felt like there may be some education opportunity around business owners in particular, and they're seeing some examples of this sort of attitude and of the culture of car culture, and never wanting to give up a parking space or access to a dumpster or something like that for what could be a pretty essential infrastructure for walking and biking that may even help their businesses. But if there's that education gap or that misunderstanding, then that's a problem. And then finally with DOT, starting to see some changes in senior leadership and technical staff at NCDOT, and hoping that, you know, those institutional changes can come along with that. And we're just wondering out loud about ways we could accelerate that. So I think I'll stop there. I don't think you wanted me to talk about solutions yet, so I'll just stop right there.
Actually, Jason, if you do have some solutions, I think it's fine to go ahead and talk about those. I think what we did here in person is talk about both. So
Okay.
I think it would be helpful if the groups report out on everything.
Sure, that sounds good. So big picture with solutions. Actually, it was more of like we just kind of went off one after another. So I'm just going to go through some of those as some examples. But we started talking about safe routes to school, for example, and we were thinking a little bit about how those programs get implemented and how schools are selected. And just the examples that were given were more personal observations from having grown up in Raleigh. That one of our participants was saying that, you know, she felt like she went to some of the larger schools in Raleigh and they didn't have any of those programs, and some of the smaller schools did, and just wondering how those decisions are made. And so something to think about there. One great idea that somebody brought up was the idea to push forward with with the integration of land uses, in particular with corner store initiatives and ADUs. The idea there being that we can't afford to build new connections to all of our residential and commercial areas in between them, and that we really need to think about shortening the distance of the trips for people so that they, you know, don't need to get in the car or don't need to traverse dangerous connections to get to the grocery store. They can instead access it in their own neighborhoods. So that's something that I think sounds promising. We also talked about the over focus on requiring traffic studies for everything, and how some of that should be replaced with more of a transit analysis, or could be anyway. Another observation from somebody who grew up in Raleigh was that this is totally not the Raleigh that they grew up in, except for the transportation infrastructure. It's the same transportation infrastructure, but not the same city otherwise. And just the need, you know, for those sorts of updates. We talked about humanizing the data. Thought that Portland example that Angie gave in the presentation was great as a way of communicating the importance of this. We talked about how some other cities, like the city of Austin, have strong tactical bike and ped implementation programs where, you know, they'll have an assigned engineer that goes out every week and sees what they can implement from their existing plans with lightweight fixes, and just does those every week, week after week in different places. Those types of things, you know, won't be possible until we solve the issue of staffing gaps in the city. So sorry, Paul, but I think one of the solutions we came up with was that we should keep Paul. We shouldn't let him leave, and that would be one way to help the city of Raleigh. I think that's sort of it. We got to the end there. We have more notes that go into more detail, but we can share those after the call.
Great, Jason and everybody in that group, thank you. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
Right. So we have another online group, right?
I can go ahead and go next if y'all can hear me. This is Matt.
Yeah, we hear you.
It's just Jason for going first. Yeah, I know in the end of the agenda we have this you know, what's the one thing you're going to do to help the city going forward? I think that is to tie down Paul Black there in the room and don't let him escape. That's an easy first short-term action item that we can get accomplished today. At any rate, I'll jump in. I'll just, since we kind of do an issue solution, I'll just kind of go issue solution, more or less in that way. But speed was the big thing that came up, not surprising. Speed limits being too high, traffic going higher than the speed limits, and the fact that there's not enough enforcement of that. And, you know, an interesting example that Ruben brought up was Oakwood neighborhood compared to South Park. So there's really no difference there in the land use and street design, but Oakwood has 30-mile-an-hour speed limits, South Park has 35. And we think it's really just due to the power and influence, economic influence of the communities that, you know, Oakwood was able to maybe advocate more and get the speed limit changed, whereas South Park may not have the resources or the time or not feel like they're being heard. So I think that speed limit conversation and what we want to look at from a citywide perspective of consistency would be good. So lower speed limits and making sure we're not just doing it for the communities that speak up the loudest. Related to that, we have a lot of NCDOT roadways, and so that's a challenge and one of our biggest barriers. And typically the goal for NCDOT engineers is to move traffic through as quickly as possible. And that's a problem for us in the city for walking and biking. So to address that, try to have the separated facilities and accommodations, separated bikeways and sidewalks, median islands in those situations, and try to look at the function of those roadways. Ruben brought up a good point that maybe some of these roadways are overbuilt. Is there any opportunity to reduce lanes or change their function? How do we make sure that we're accommodating all users? This is not, this is going to be a long-term endeavor, but those are really our pinch points for our DOT-wide roadways. Traffic calming was another thing that was brought up, that most neighborhoods are not traffic calm. So you see traffic cutting through residential communities. And what he talked about is that we really need to design roads to the design speed we want. A good example, I think, that John Puker brought up was that Shelley Road has been used as a cut through in the past to Six Forks, and they've added speed humps. That's not, necessarily the best traffic calming solution, but it has helped. And we talked a lot about the solution for that being that in many cases, grassroots efforts and neighborhood groups are really the way to get at traffic calming and what they can do. If any of you guys have been to the Bedford neighborhood, they have done a lot of intentional things around on-street parking with their cars and design that neighborhood to be extraordinarily traffic calm so they don't have cut through. So, I think the solution there is to work with community groups and make that a grassroots effort in those communities. We had a lot of practitioners in our group, so we talked a lot about signals and intersections. We don't have enough no turn on reds in downtown to prevent that conflict. The LPIs, it's great we have them, but we think they're probably the shortest they could possibly be right now at 3 seconds. Is there an opportunity to increase that? Clearance time downtown for countdown signals probably needs to, probably not to standard in some places. We noted that there are some cases where the countdown starts at 7 or 6. And, if you're somebody who's trying to get across, who's slower or maybe older in age and those types of things, that's just not enough time to do that. The other issue we noticed was that was brought up is there are a lot of faulty PED signals out there that need to be repaired. So apparently that's a fairly common issue. So a lot of conversation around those signals, and I think the answer is, obviously better attention to maintenance around that. I know apparently NCDOT used to have a 6-month maintenance check-in of those signals in the past, for example, and that may not be in place anymore, but what can the city do to make sure those are maintained better? And then I think just a good point in general is let's stop using design minimums for pedestrians. Let's start doing what's preferable for pedestrians. So let's lengthen the LPI, let's lengthen the countdown signals. And those are some things that we talked about just from a specific standpoint of signalization. Another one that was brought up, I'm almost done, is just the issue of sidewalks being blocked or not maintained. So vegetation growing up in the sidewalks, often cars being parked in sidewalks, bicycle lanes, construction sites overtaking sidewalks, porta potties blocking sidewalks, and people having to go around those being a safety issue. And I think that the challenge there, I think there's some city ordinance in place, but does that need to be revisited? Maybe we don't have enough resources for code enforcement officers, but one solution we thought about was HOAs becoming more aware of these policies and getting those communications out to their residents. If there's ways that we can do that, then that might go a long way. And certainly just the enforcement, particularly of construction sites and maintaining that sidewalk and path of travel for pedestrians. I think I heard, Jason, you mentioned something about culture, the car culture. And so, kind of thinking about how we change behaviors over time, making sure that we're doing as much to engage the youth and having a consistent availability of programs, not just for the well-off, the higher income communities, but also the lower income communities. And part of that is just teaching kids how to walk and bike in their community. And the way to change behaviors, get more cars off the road, get more people walking and biking, is to engage our youth. So that's a solution we talked about, is really focusing on our youth and those types of programs. I think I'm almost done. I think the two kind of levels of this from infrastructure is thinking we need better bike ped spines. You know, there's a lot of talk about the Triangle Bikeway from Raleigh to RTP. What if Raleigh had a signature bike facility that functioned more like an interstate, and it was a spine with a lot of connections off of it, more like a bicycle superhighway? Just having those separated longer distance types of facilities like the Neuse River Trail, how do we get those across town that can function well and create that separate facility? But also having just those small gaps that are out there. So we had, I think it was Jen, who I think may have dropped. Oh, she's still on now. Was just saying that she brings her 2 and 4 and 6-year-old, and in many cases she's got a nice section to bike on, but then there's these small gaps that are out there in the bikeway system that are not for all ages and abilities, just to make that extra bit of distance to a school. So how do we focus on, you know, some of these short trip conversions from taking your car to walking and biking, what's going to be filling those gaps, and doing a gap program for bikeways similar to what we do for sidewalks, and making sure it's kind of like that last mile off of a good bike facility or pedestrian facility, making sure that we're well connected. I think maybe the last thing I'll mention is just kind of what Angie spoke about earlier, in terms of the diversifying populations in suburban areas that has happened with some gentrification that has happened. A number of fatalities have been happening out in those suburban multi-lane roadways in recent years. US 401 was brought up as an example. So again, I think that it's, you know, part of it is our biggest challenge is what to do with these big multi-lane roadways. And I think that it's going to be continued, you know, pounding of the doors in Raleigh and DC that I think is going to continue to have to happen. But I think also it's just some of those conversations that we need to be having as a community. So I think, I'm sure that I missed some things. Like Jason, we typed up a whole lot of notes that we'll share out with the group. And thanks everybody for participating. We had a very active group. So the fact that, you know, John brought up a good point. These folks, you all could have been out riding a bike this afternoon, but you've stuck it out with us. We really, really appreciate y'all's participation.
Thank you. So I'll talk about the robust discussion that we had in person. First, on a quick personal note, I see my professor, John Puker, there online. I took his transportation planning class at Rutgers a decade ago. It was the best class I ever took, and it really opened my eyes to all the things that we need to do here in this country. Some might say it's radical, but I think when you look at it in a global context, what's radical is the way we do things now, and the lack of priority we give to active transportation. So we had a great discussion about that. In terms of the issues, we were joined by a group of 5th graders from Explorers Middle, and it was elementary. It was fantastic to ask them, how did they get around? How would they like to get around? And it was exactly what you would expect. They have all sorts of obstacles to being able to get to places that have to be driven. And they would very much like to not have to do that all the time. So we heard a lot about one, land use side of things. Distances are too far. That there are not safe places. We heard from both our adults and our student friends that there just aren't safe places, and that is the fundamental barrier here. That what we're doing is, and I think this is addressed to the state, but also to the city, it's not big enough. What we have been doing is not big enough to fundamentally move the needle in the way that we need to. In terms of some of the strategies and solutions, I think the online groups hit a lot of that, but on the more funding and resource side, looking to rededicate transportation right away where we can, ensure that budget decisions are considering these broader impacts. One purpose of transportation obviously is to move vehicles around, but are we considering climate impacts, health impacts at the same time we're making those decisions? And frankly, to hold those decisions up to our values. We have lots of great values in our comprehensive plan. We have goals for reducing carbon emissions. The values and goals are there. I don't think the budget matches. And in the end, what your budget says that's really where your values lie. So I think there's an opportunity to make sure that those two conversations are happening at the same time. More on the specific side, more harnessing of data and understanding the issues in a more thorough way. And that's something that we've started to think about with our Vision Zero planning that started to happen. Speed, that's just critical. We heard speed limits are too high. We do not have the ability to set those lower across the board. On every city council agenda, you will find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 streets where there's a request that is always approved to lower the speed limit. We have a lot of streets in the city of Raleigh. A piecemeal approach is going to always leave gaps, and it's going to take forever to do. We need the ability to lower those streets more, those speed more holistically, looking at funding both locally and state. Are these projects just increasing vehicle miles traveled? We need to take a harder look at what they're doing, what they're accomplishing. And then just fundamentally to have these conversations in Raleigh, locally and at the state level. And we're lucky we have both. And to wrap this up, I know y'all have spent a lot of time this afternoon, and you spent a lot of your own time on this issue at other times. And I think one question that people always rightly have is, where does this stuff go? We're taking all these notes, we got flip charts. Was it worth it? Well, I will tell you, this is going to go to two places. It's going to go down Hargett Street to the municipal building, and we're going to have some bold recommendations for how we can take action on this issue. And it's going to go one other place, down Jones Street to the legislative building. And we're going to have some actions that we need the state's help with. And I think with the support of people who are in this space, who are working hard and care about these issues, that there are some big steps that we can get done. And I really appreciate everybody's time and thought and passion today. Thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason.
Appreciate it.